December 26, 1944. A single message lands on a German headquarters table, deep in the Ardennes forest. And the most experienced field marshals in the Third Reich, men who had crushed France in 6 weeks, who had pushed all the way into the Soviet Union, go completely silent. Not because they lost a battle, because they realized something far worse. They had underestimated George S. Patton. And by the time that truth settled in, it was already too late. Stay with me. Because what unfolded over those few critical days didn't just rescue an American division, it marked the beginning of the end for Germany's last major offensive in the West. And the men staring at that map, on the losing side of it, understood that before almost anyone else did. What Germany thought it knew. To really understand the shock that hit the German high command that morning, you need to know what they believed walking into December of 1944. By that point, the senior German generals were not dreamers, they were realists. Men like Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, had been fighting long enough to read the numbers clearly. Fuel was running out. Replacements were barely arriving. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe's skies, was a ghost of what it had been. But Hitler had one card left, the Ardennes. That same dense, frozen stretch of forest through which German armor had swept in 1940, catching the Allies completely flat-footed and collapsing France in a matter of weeks. The plan, codenamed Watch on the Rhine, and later known to history as the Battle of the Bulge, was to punch hard through thinly held American lines, seize the vital port of Antwerp, and drive a wedge straight through the Allied armies. If it worked, Churchill and Roosevelt might have no choice but to come to the table. It was always a long shot. Von Rundstedt is widely reported to have had deep reservations from the start, privately viewing the objectives as far beyond what Germany's remaining strength could realistically deliver. But the logic behind the plan, such as it was, rested entirely on one thing. Speed. Get through before the Allies could react, create chaos, force them to blink. And for the first few days, it actually worked. German armor punched deep into Allied lines. American units were overrun, surrounded, cut off. Winter weather grounded Allied air power. Snow and ice and sheer confusion spread across the front like a fog that nobody could see through. And sitting right in the middle of all of it, a quiet, little Belgian crossroads town called Bastogne. Hold on. Because what Germany did not know about Bastogne, and what they had completely failed to account for with Patton, is exactly where this whole story turns. Keep watching. Bastogne wasn't much to look at. A small market town, modest, unremarkable. 7 roads converging in one spot. But in a winter offensive through the Ardennes, where frozen roads were the only arteries through which armor could actually move, those 7 roads made that little town, arguably, the most strategically important piece of ground in all of Western Europe. Whoever held Bastogne controlled movement. Whoever lost it, lost the battle. The Germans knew it. That's precisely why they surrounded it. By December 21st, the 101st Airborne Division, along with scattered elements of armored and tank destroyer units, found themselves completely encircled, cut off on all sides, running desperately low on ammunition, food, and medical supplies. The snow didn't let up. The cold was savage. Men were going into combat without proper winter gear because the German attack had come so fast that the supply system simply hadn't caught up. Then the German commander sent a formal demand. Surrender. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe sent back a single word. Nuts. It became one of the most famous replies in American military history. Defiant. Contemptuous. Utterly, unmistakably American. But defiance alone doesn't break an encirclement. And the Germans, watching the perimeter hold while knowing the men inside were slowly freezing and running out of everything, made a calculation. Time was on their side. The Americans were going nowhere. All Germany had to do was wait. That calculation, that assumption, is where they made their fatal mistake. Because they had forgotten about the man, roughly 100 miles to the south. They had forgotten about Patton. What he was already doing, before anyone had even asked him, is the part of this story most people never hear. Don't go anywhere. The meeting that changed everything. December 19th, 1944. Verdun, France. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower called an emergency conference. Senior commanders from across the Allied front came in, faces drawn tight. The German breakthrough was 3 days old. The situation was deteriorating by the hour. Bastogne was already being circled. The question sitting on that table was simple and brutal. How do we respond? And how fast can we actually get a relief force to Bastogne? The room carried the weight of what everyone privately knew. This kind of redeployment, pivoting a force large enough to punch through German lines, turning it a full 90 degrees from its current direction, across winter terrain, on roads glazed with ice, was the kind of operation that military planners normally needed weeks to coordinate, weeks to move supply lines, weeks to reassign artillery, weeks to get the pieces in the right places without everything jamming up on the same frozen road. Then Patton spoke. He said he could launch an attack with 3 divisions, within 48 hours. The room went quiet. Officers glanced at each other. Eisenhower pushed back. This was not the moment for bold talk that couldn't be backed up. The stakes were too high for that. Patton wasn't talking boldly. He was reporting a fact. What nobody in that room knew yet, what turned the skeptical silence into something closer to stunned understanding, was that Patton had already seen this coming. Before he drove to Verdun, before the conference even started, Patton had quietly told his staff to draw up 3 separate contingency plans. Different routes, different unit combinations, different timelines, all of them aimed north. At Bastogne, he had solved the problem before anyone told him there was one. His staff already had code words assigned. 1 phone call from Patton, 1 word spoken, and the machinery would begin to move. He didn't need those 48 hours to plan. He needed them to move, and to fight through whatever the Germans put between him and Bastogne. That gap between an army that was already ready and an army still sitting in a room figuring out what to do is the gap that changed the war. The march. What came next stands as one of the most remarkable feats of military movement in the entire Second World War. The U.S. Third Army, more than 130,000 men, hundreds of tanks, thousands of vehicles, pivoted 90 degrees. In the middle of winter, through snow, on roads coated in ice, in temperatures cold enough to freeze engine oil and split tire rubber clean apart. Every staff college in the world taught the same thing. This kind of maneuver takes weeks. You don't swing a field army like it's a car changing lanes. You reroute supply lines, pull artillery units, and reassign them, carefully stagger which convoys use which roads, so nothing grinds to a standstill on a single frozen junction somewhere in the middle of Belgium. Patton's staff did it in days. The men of the 4th Armored Division, out front, leading the push, drove through the night. When snow blocked the road, they found a way around it. When a bridge was iced over, they crossed it and pushed on. When German units moved to block their path, they punched through. And those fights were not clean. They were not quick. Every mile of that narrow corridor north cost men. Real men with names and units and families waiting at home. There was no elegant maneuver here, no clever flanking move, just relentless grinding forward pressure and the kind of determination to absorb punishment and keep moving that you cannot teach in a classroom. Patton was there personally, moving between units, talking to commanders, refusing to let the word can't settle anywhere near him. He understood something at the core of armored warfare. That momentum is itself a weapon. An enemy that can't predict where you'll be next, can't build a solid defense against where you're actually heading. And the Germans, accustomed to watching Allied forces respond slowly, carefully, methodically, couldn't quite process what their own reports were telling them. American armor appearing in places it had no business being, moving faster than the roads should have allowed, and not stopping when darkness fell. When those reports reached the men at the top, the field marshals and generals who had spent their entire careers studying how wars are fought, what they said and what they understood tells you everything. That's next. The moment of reckoning. December 26, 1944. The message arrived at German headquarters in the Ardennes. It sat there, quietly, in its implications. Then it became undeniable. The American encirclement at Bastogne had been broken. The decision had been made on December 19th. The march had started the same day. It had taken nearly a week of hard, grinding fighting, through snow, through German blocking positions, through terrain that punished every mile. But on December 26th, elements of the 4th Armored Division finally punched through to the 101st Airborne. The corridor they opened was narrow. Fighting continued around it. But the ring around Bastogne was broken. Field Marshal von Rundstedt stood over the map table. Officers filled the room. Nobody spoke at first. The implications moved through the room like cold air under a door. General Hasso von Manteuffel had commanded the armored forces in that sector. He had led panzer divisions on the Eastern Front. He understood mobile warfare as well as anyone still drawing breath in 1944. His post-war memoirs and accounts from officers around him make clear that Manteuffel grasped the full significance of what had just happened almost immediately. Not as a simple tactical setback, but as proof of something the German offensive had never accounted for. Allied command could move fast, could pivot hard, could act before Germany had time to adjust. That was not supposed to be possible. For weeks, German intelligence had been watching Patton. They respected him. They tracked his aggression, his refusal to give an enemy time to breathe. But even those who genuinely feared his reputation had held on to one belief, one assumption they needed to be true. Winter would slow him down. Bastogne was surrounded. The roads were ice. The skies were gray and low. Logic, basic military logic, said the Americans would take time, consolidate, plan carefully. The relief of Bastogne was weeks away at best. Patton had treated that logic like it didn't exist. Field Marshal Walter Model received the same report at his own headquarters. Model had been called Hitler's fireman because he was the man they summoned when a front was collapsing and needed someone to hold it together. Post-war accounts describe him as one of the few German senior commanders who immediately understood what the relief of Bastogne actually meant at the operational level. He recognized and later acknowledged to staff that the Americans hadn't simply rescued a surrounded division. They had shown what their command structure could do under pressure. Fast, pre-planned, decisive, bold in a way that the German army by late 1944 simply could no longer match. The conclusion that emerged from German assessments of the period is telling. It wasn't the fighting quality of the American soldier that had settled the question at Bastogne. German commanders had long since stopped underestimating American soldiers. It was the speed of the decisions above them. And that distinction matters more than it might first appear. The German army of 1944 was still, man for man, a dangerous and capable force. German soldiers fought with real skill and ferocity all the way to the end. German armor was, in many respects, technically ahead of what the Americans were fielding. But the ability to make fast decisions, to adapt, to authorize a subordinate to do something bold without waiting 3 days for permission from above, that had been slowly strangled out of the Wehrmacht. Hitler interfered constantly. He second-guessed. He overruled. He blamed. And over time, the natural response from every level of command was the same. Don't act without checking upstairs first, because acting boldly and failing brought consequences nobody wanted to face. Patton existed in a completely different world. Eisenhower trusted him. His corps commanders trusted him. His division commanders trusted him. When Patton said move, they moved. That difference, between an army built on initiative and an army built on permission, was sitting right there on the map table in the Ardennes. On December 26, 1944, Berlin reacts the fury and the lie. When the news reached Adolf Hitler, his reaction was entirely predictable, and in its own way deeply tragic. He raged. He blamed the local commanders, called them weak, called them defeatists, said they had failed to hold ground that could have been held. He issued furious, immediate orders: counterattack, retake Bastogne, restore the encirclement, prove that German resolve had not broken. The generals heard him out, saluted, and walked back to their maps. And there, away from the political temperature of Berlin, they looked at those maps with the cold, clear eyes of men who had long since stopped believing the orders they received had any real connection to the situation on the ground. Bastogne was not coming back, not with what they had left. Fuel reserves were measured not in weeks, but in days. Armored formations were sitting idle because there was simply no petrol to move them. Artillery ammunition was being rationed. The Luftwaffe, which in 1940 had ruled the sky over France, was grounded. When the weather broke, Allied aircraft filled that sky in overwhelming numbers, shooting up convoys, bombing road junctions, making movement in daylight something close to suicide. The men in those headquarters knew the truth that Hitler was refusing to look at. The moment had passed. The Ardennes offensive had been Germany's final serious play in the West, and it had been undone not purely by the weight of Allied numbers, not purely by material superiority, but by the speed at which one American general had turned a crisis into a counterattack. Von Manteuffel, who wrote extensively about this period in his post-war memoirs and gave detailed interviews in the years that followed, reflected that the failure to hold Bastogne marked the point where the offensive's collapse became irreversible. Not because of one dramatic moment, but because of everything the German plan had simply refused to prepare for. The resilience of Allied forces, the depth of American logistics, and the kind of operational boldness that Bastogne had now laid bare for anyone willing to see it. But here's what those German commanders understood that tends to get buried in the history books. It wasn't just Bastogne as a place, it was what Bastogne proved about the whole shape of the war. And that realization, that quiet, cold moment of clarity, is really the heart of this story. What the German generals truly understood. In the days after December 26th, German officers began talking to each other more openly, carefully, away from political observers, away from the SS liaison officers posted to watch for any trace of defeatism. And what they were saying to each other wasn't really about Bastogne, not about the town. It was about what Bastogne proved. The relief operation had shown that the Americans could redeploy an entire field army. Armor, artillery, logistics, air coordination, all of it, in winter weather that should have made it impossible. It showed that Allied command was not the cautious, committee-driven machine German doctrine had counted on. It was flexible. It was decisive. It was willing to take real operational risks. And then there was the question of logistics. The fuel dumps, the ammunition stocks, the replacement pipelines, the convoys that kept rolling regardless of snow and darkness. American supply could sustain this kind of rapid, large-scale movement through the worst winter in years. Germany's could not anymore. German officers had once dismissed American armies in 1942 and 1943, inexperienced, cautious, well-supplied, but poorly led. That view had been revised a long time ago, but even those who now fully respected what they were fighting against had held on to certain assumptions. Winter would constrain American boldness. Allied command was too slow, too careful, too reliant on material weight to make the kind of hard, fast call that the situation at Bastogne demanded. Bastogne had taken that assumption and put it in the ground, not in theory, in the snow, against German armor. In the space of less than a week, von Rundstedt convened further briefings over the days that followed. Contemporary accounts and post-war testimonies from staff officers describe a commander who had privately concluded, well before the official numbers confirmed it, that the offensive had failed in its essential purpose. He studied the maps, the arrows bending back now, the front lines ragged and buckling under pressure. And what he communicated to his inner staff made one thing clear. In his assessment, the Americans had taken back the initiative. And once an enemy holds the initiative against a force as stretched and starved of resources as Germany's had become, the math of recovery becomes almost impossible to solve. Some of the older officers standing in those rooms, men who had soldiered through the First World War, who had watched Germany rebuild and rearm, who had seen those same forests swallow Allied resistance in 1940, remembered a different time. France. 1940. German armor racing through the Ardennes. Allied generals scrambling to respond, always half a step behind, never quite catching up. Now it was Germany in that position, always reacting, always a decision behind. And they understood, with the kind of cold, professional clarity that comes when the numbers stop lying to you, that they were not going to turn it around, not in the West, not against an enemy with Patton leading the spearhead, Allied air power overhead whenever the clouds broke, and a supply system that could keep an army moving through a European winter. The war in the West was no longer about what was possible. It was about what was coming. Patton's legacy in enemy eyes. There is something genuinely striking about the way German commanders talked about Patton in their memoirs, their interviews, their private reflections written years after the war. There was no bitterness in it, no contempt, no attempt to explain him away or chip at what he had done. Just a kind of sober professional acknowledgement. He had done exactly what German commanders had spent decades priding themselves on doing. The German military tradition, running back through Moltke, through Schlieffen, sharpened in the years between the wars by theorists who had studied every failure and every success, had always placed its highest value on exactly the qualities Patton put on display at Bastogne: speed, initiative, acting before the enemy finishes deciding, trusting the man below you to figure out how to get it done without holding his hand every step of the way. Mission command, give the objective, trust the commander, get out of the way. That idea had made the Wehrmacht the most feared fighting force on earth in 1939 and 1940. And now, watching Patton reposition an entire army and punch through an encirclement in the time it took the German High Command to fully process what was happening, those same German commanders were watching their own finest ideas being turned around and used against them by a man who had clearly read the same military history they had, who had understood the same principles, and who, crucially, had been given the room to act on them. while they had been stripped of that room by a leadership that trusted no one and permitted nothing without approval from the top. German post-war accounts come back to this point again and again. The relief of Bastogne was not, in their telling, primarily about American manpower or American equipment. It was about the ability to convert a decision, fast, clean, pre-planned, into physical movement before the other side could adjust. That is what impressed them. That is what troubled them. And it goes straight to the core of why Bastogne matters beyond the maps and the casualty figures. Great armies run on trust. The trust a senior commander places in his subordinate. The trust a government places in its military professionals. The trust that moves down through a chain of command when the people at every level believe the person above them is dealing in reality. Not ego, not ideology, not a need to be obeyed. By the end of 1944, Germany had almost none of that left. Hitler micromanaged obsessively. Officers who delivered bad news got replaced or worse. Nobody at any level dared to act boldly without clearance from above, because bold action that went wrong carried consequences that nobody was willing to face. Patton lived on the other side of that wall. He was not an easy man. He was controversial, combustible, and had nearly lost his command more than once. But when the Ardennes exploded and Eisenhower needed someone who would act fast and hit hard without asking for permission every half hour, they called Patton. And Patton came through, because the system he operated within, imperfect as it was in many ways, trusted him enough to let him be what he was. The meaning that lasts. The Battle of the Bulge officially ended in late January 1945. German losses exceeded 60,000 killed, wounded, and captured. Irreplaceable men, irreplaceable equipment. Germany's last major offensive reserve in the West, exhausted. 3 months later, American forces were crossing the Rhine. 4 months after Bastogne, the war in Europe was over. History is full of turning points that only reveal themselves in hindsight, once the dust has settled and the books have been written. Bastogne is not that kind of turning point. The German generals understood what it meant while it was happening. Standing in cold rooms, looking at maps that had stopped making sense, they saw clearly that the gamble had failed. Not because the plan was reckless on paper, not because German soldiers had stopped fighting, but because one American general had refused, absolutely refused, to let a crisis become a catastrophe. He had seen the problem coming. He had built the solution before being asked. He moved when moving looked impossible. He had fought through everything placed in his path. And he had arrived in time. Speed had returned to the battlefield, and it no longer belonged to Germany. The name Patton stayed with those German commanders long after the snow melted and the war finally ended. Not as the name of an enemy, not as a source of bitterness. As a standard, a man who understood that in war, and honestly, in most things that matter, the side that acts while the other side is still deciding wins. He didn't slow down. He never slowed down. And in the frozen fields around a crossroads town in Belgium that most of the world had never heard of, that refusal to slow down helped end Germany's last offensive in the West. If this story was worth your time, and I hope it was, go ahead and hit like and subscribe. Every week we go deep into the moments that shaped the world we live in. The decisions, the people, the details that deserve to be remembered. Next time, we follow Patton's Third Army in the weeks after Bastogne, as it stopped being a rescue force and became something else entirely. A battering ram. The war wasn't over, and Patton wasn't done. I'll see you then.